There comes a moment when life itself stops pretending. The mask breaks. The silence grows louder than words. And deep within you, something begins to awaken, not by chance, but by necessity. Carl Jung called it the turning of the soul toward itself. If this message has found you now, it's because you are ready. So breathe and listen. The journey begins here.
There are moments in life when the human spirit can no longer bear the mask it has worn for too long. We call this crisis depression, exhaustion, or existential confusion. But in truth, it is a sacred signal from the psyche itself. It is not a breakdown, it is a breakthrough disguised as collapse when a person says, "I can no longer live this way." The soul has already begun to whisper a deeper message, that the life one has been living is no longer large enough for the truth that now demands to be born. I have seen this countless times in my patients, and indeed, within myself. The ego clings desperately to the known habits, beliefs, relationships, possessions, because it fears dissolution. Yet the unconscious, that vast sea beneath our waking mind, does not ask for our permission to evolve. It will dismantle our certainties with the precision of divine necessity. We imagine that life happens to us from the outside, but the truth is the transformation begins within, and the outer events merely mirror what the inner world has already decided must occur. When the inner structure that once held you begins to crumble, you experience an unnameable fear. It is as though the ground gives way beneath your feet. You search for explanations, for medical diagnosis, for distractions, for someone to blame, but all of these are attempts to escape what must be faced. The psyche, that autonomous and mysterious totality of our being, has one purpose: wholeness, and wholeness can never be achieved by remaining in fragments. We live, all of us, under the tyranny of the persona, the mask we present to the world. It is the polite smile at the dinner table when we are dying inside, the confident handshake when our heart trembles with self-doubt. Society rewards the mask, not the man. The collective wants predictability, not authenticity. And so from childhood, we learn to play roles: student, employee, espouse, citizen, until we forget there was ever an unmasked face beneath it all. Yet there comes a day, and I assure you it comes for each of us, when the mask grows too tight. It no longer protects, it suffocates. The polite phrases, the successful career, the well-arranged life, all begin to ring hollow. You sense that what you have built does not belong to you anymore. It is then that the unconscious begins its revolt. It sends you dreams of loss and rebirth, of fire and water, of crumbling houses and hidden rooms. It sends symptoms: anxiety, fatigue, alienation. These are not punishments, they are invitations. The psyche does not destroy for the sake of destruction. It dismantles to make space for the self to emerge. We call this process individuation, the movement from the borrowed life to the true life. It is not a luxury of philosophers. It is the essential task of every human soul. Individuation begins the moment we stop trying to fit and start trying to understand. It is the moment when we realize that the problem is not the world's hostility, but our own inner division. The ego has become estranged from the self, and the distance between them manifests as suffering. Suffering is the compass of transformation. The modern man avoids it at all costs, interpreting pain as a malfunction. But the ancients, wiser than we, understood suffering as initiation. In every myth, the hero must descend into darkness before he can ascend to wisdom. There is no awakening without disillusionment, no resurrection without crucifixion. The unconscious follows this sacred law relentlessly. When I speak of the unconscious, I do not mean merely repressed memories or childish wishes. I mean the living intelligence that governs the totality of the psyche, the creative ground of symbols, the secret architect of destiny. It communicates not in language, but in images, in synchronicities, in the subtle alignment of inner and outer events. When one begins to awaken, one starts noticing these patterns, the book that falls open to the exact sentence one needed, the dream that predicts the event of the following day, the stranger whose casual words pierce through your confusion like an oracle. This is not superstition. This is the natural language of the psyche when the ego begins to listen. We call it synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. The outer world arranges itself to reflect the inner movement of the soul. When a man reaches the limit of his known identity, the self, the organizing principle of wholeness, begins to communicate. It does so not to entertain, but to guide. It sends signs because the conscious mind is too narrow to grasp the vast plan unfolding beneath. You may think of the psyche as a kingdom divided. The ego sits upon its fragile throne, believing itself to be sovereign, but beneath its feet lies a vast subterranean realm, the domain of the shadow. Everything that the ego rejects, its fears, impulses, desire, wounds, takes residence there. The shadow is not evil. It is simply that which has been banished from awareness. Yet, the more we deny it, the more it controls us. What we repress does not disappear. It acts in disguise, manipulating our relationships, our choices, our moods. The greatest act of courage is to descend into this realm consciously. That descent is what the modern world avoids most fiercely. We prefer stimulation to silence, consumption to contemplation, opinion to understanding. We run from the darkness as though light could exist without it. But to reject the shadow is to reject half of our soul. The man who refuses to know his darkness becomes a puppet of it. He blames others. He moralizes. He projects. He fights the external world, blind to the war within himself. Individuation demande réconciliation. We must make peace with our shadow, not by excusing it, but by understanding it. It is a living archive of all that we are and all we might yet become. It contains our lost vitality, our forgotten creativity. our repressed love. To meet the shadow is to rediscover power. That is why so many fear it, for power always demands responsibility. In my studies and in the dreams of countless individuals, I observed that when the shadow is integrated, the world outside begins to shift. Relationships change. Synchronicities multiply. Paths open. It is as though the inner kingdom, once divided, begins to unify, and the external kingdom responds in kind. We do not create reality by wishful thinking. We magnetize it by psychological coherence, but coherence cannot exist while we are at war with ourselves. And that is the illness of our time. Inner fragmentation. The modern person lives entirely in the persona, over-adapted to the collective, underdeveloped in the soul. He identifies with productivity, with opinions, with possessions, and calls this identity. But identity without depth is mimicry. It is a mask upon a void. The reason our civilization is anxious, restless, addicted, and violent is because it worships the mask and neglects the mystery. We have been taught that consciousness is our crown, that to be rational is to be complete. But consciousness without the unconscious is arrogance. Rationality alone builds machines, not meaning. We have reached the moon, but lost our connection to the stars of the psyche. We have invented gods of steel and glass, but have forgotten the living symbols that speak in dreams. When we lose the symbolic life, we become spiritually homeless. Each of us must therefore begin our own symbolic journey, not as a philosophy, but as a lived reality. The myths are not dead stories. They are psychic maps. Every dream you forget is a missed message from the depths. Every emotion you repress is an unopened letter from the divine within you. The unconscious is patient, but it is relentless. If ignored too long, it will force itself through crisis, and that crisis, the breakdown, the burnout, the unbearable emptiness, is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the sacred invitation to reclaim your life from automation. It is the moment when destiny knocks, disguised as despair. You may resist, you may hit, but once the call to individuation is heard, it cannot be silenced. The ego trembles before this process, because it feels like death. In a sense, it is the death of illusion, of roles, of borrowed values. But beyond that, death lies a life more authentic than the one we abandoned. The self does not destroy without purpose. It dismantles only what stands between you and the truth. This, then, is what I wish to say to all who feel lost, fatigued, disoriented. You are not ill. You are in transformation. The life that collapses around you is not a punishment, but a preparation. When the old structure can no longer contain your expanding consciousness, it must fall. And though you may fear the ruins, remember this: every true temple is first built from the ashes of the false. The question is not, how do I stop the collapse, but how can I cooperate with what is emerging? That is where individuation truly begins. There are no accidents in the movements of the psyche. What we call coincidence is the outer echo of an inner necessity when something arrives in our lives at precisely the moment we need it. A book, a person, a phrase, a dream, we experience what I have termed synchronicity, the meeting of inner and outer events through meaning rather than causality. This phenomenon reveals that psyche and matter are not separate worlds, but expressions of the same underlying order. The ancients called it anima mundi, the soul of the world. Modern man, obsessed with measurement, has forgotten that reality also speaks in symbols, but the soul has never ceased to listen. It arranges the world subtly, delicately, to assist the journey of awakening. And when we finally begin to perceive these alignments, we discover that life itself is a dialogue between consciousness and the deep unconscious. Synchronicity begins to occur when we approach the limit of the rational mind. It is as if the walls of ordinary perception become translucent and something greater begins to shine through. We feel guided, but by what? By whom? It is not an external God pulling strings from the heavens. It is the self, the totality of the psyche, orchestrating encounters and moments to remind the ego that it is not alone in its struggle whenever we feel trapped in the monotony of our routines. The self will conspire to break the pattern. It might do so through illness, heartbreak, loss, or coincidence, whatever form it takes. The message is the same. Wake up. There is more to you than this narrow identity. The tragedy of the modern world is not suffering, it is meaninglessness. The psyche can endure almost anything if it has a purpose, but without meaning, even comfort becomes torture. We are surrounded by individuals who live as spectators of their own existence, numbed by endless information, yet starving for wisdom. They seek distraction because silence terrifies them. For in silence, the shadow speaks, and the shadow never flatters. It whispers the truths we least want to hear, that we are hypocritical, envious, frightened, and incomplete. But here lies the paradox. Only by facing this darkness do we discover the light that no one can take away from us. The shadow is not the enemy of the soul. It is its guardian. It guards the threshold to authenticity. To pass it, we must abandon moral superiority and accept our humanity in full. Every saint carries a sinner within, and every sinner hides a fragment of the divine. I often said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. We must, therefore, descend not in theory, but in experience. We must enter our dreams, our contradictions, our shame or désir. We must confront the aspects of ourselves we have exiled. The descent is painful, but it is also sacred. It is the path that every mythic hero must tread, to die to the false and be reborn to the true. When the shadow rises, it will take many forms. It may appear as anger at the world, as depression, as cynicism, as a voice that whispers, "You are not enough." These manifestations are not random. They are the psyche's language. To fight them blindly is to wage war against our own evolution. We must instead ask, what is this feeling trying to reveal? What truth does this symptom carry? In analysis, I witnessed transformations that no theory could predict. When a patient ceased fighting their anxiety and began listening to it, the anxiety changed character. It became a messenger rather than a tormentor. The unconscious does not aim to destroy. It aims to integrate. But integration demands attention and humility. We imagine that awakening will come as ecstasy, but more often it comes as despair. We meet God, not on mountaintops, but in ruins, in the very places where the ego is stripped bare of its pretensions. When your certainties collapse, it is not a sign of divine abandonment. It is the moment when the divine finally has room to enter. The cracks in our identity are openings through which light can reach the soul. This is why fear always stands at the doorway of transformation. Fear is the final guardian before freedom. It warns us that we are approaching something vast, something uncontrollable by intellect, and yet we must cross. If we retreat, we fall back into the sleep of conformity. If we step forward, we enter the field of the unknown, where real life begins. In the symbolic language of myth, this crossing is represented by the dragon. Every dragon is born from our own psyche. It represents the power we project outward, the authority, the judgment, the divine law we imagine exists outside of us. To slay the dragon means to withdraw those projections, to realize that the monster was a part of ourselves all along. The dragon is terrifying because it guards treasure, and that treasure is our unlived life. Beneath the fear of failure lies the desire to create. Beneath the fear of rejection lies the longing to love. Beneath the fear of death lies the instinct to truly live. If we only had the courage to face what frightens us, we would discover that our fears are maps to our deepest potential. But courage, I must insist, is not the absence of fear. It is intimacy with fear. It is the willingness to walk while trembling. The psyche rewards every act of sincerity. When we move toward what is authentic, synchronicities multiply, doors open, and coincidences become confirmations. The self responds to every gesture of truth with subtle miracles. Yet, the modern man waits. He waits for permission, for security, for external approval. He waits for someone else to define the meaning of his existence, but no savior will come. The age of external authority is ending. The new era is psychological. Each of us must become the authority of our own life. To wait for rescue is to prolong the dream of childhood. The task of adulthood, of individuation, is to assume responsibility for our own evolution. Responsibility, however, is not blame. It is the sacred act of response, the ability to respond consciously to the demands of the soul. We cannot control what happens to us, but we can choose how we relate to it. Every event joyful or tragic, conceals a message. To interpret that message is the work of inner alchemy. In ancient alchemical texts, the transformation of lead into gold was never about chemistry, it was about the soul. The lead is our unconscious material, heavy, dark, inert. The gold is consciousness, luminous, incorruptible, eternal. The alchemist's furnace was the human heart, where pain and longing are transmuted into wisdom. That process is still alive today. Each of us is an alchemist of our own psyche. Every confrontation with the shadow is a refinement of our inner gold. We suffer because we resist this process. The ego clings to its forms, terrified of change. It prefers a familiar hell to an unfamiliar heaven. But life, being wiser, will not allow us to remain stagnant forever. When stagnation persists, suffering intensifies. When resistance collapses, grace enters. What then, we might ask, lies on the other side of this fear? What happens when we truly let go, when we stop demanding guarantees and accept the uncertainty of existence? The answer cannot be given. It must be lived. But I can tell you this, what we meet beyond fear is not chaos. With depth, the self awaits us there, silent, ancient, and whole. When we reach that point, we no longer seek validation from the outer world. We no longer need to prove our worth. We begin to experience life as participation rather than competition. We recognize that every person we meet, every conflict, every attraction is an encounter with some part of ourselves, and that realization dissolves the illusion of separation. We begin to see that the soul's goal was never perfection, but wholeness. Perfection is sterile. Wholeness is alive. It embraces the light and the shadow, the joy and the sorrow, the known and the mysterious. To live from wholeness is to accept that we are both human and divine, both limited and infinite. At that stage, morality itself changes, meaning we no longer obey rules because they are imposed, but because they arise naturally from understanding. Compassion becomes instinctive, not prescribed. Love ceases to be sentimental and becomes cosmic. One no longer loves because it is right to love, but because one is love. When this awareness dawns, ordinary life is transfigured, the mundane becomes mystical, the smallest gesture a conversation, a sunrise, a breath reveals its participation in the grand rhythm of existence. You see that the same intelligence that orchestrates the movement of galaxies also arranges the details of your daily life. You realize that you have never been separate from the whole. You have simply been asleep to it. This realization is what mystics have always called awakening, but in psychological language, it is the integration of the self. It does not make one superhuman, it makes one profoundly human. One still feels fear, sorrow, desire, but they are no longer enemies. They are recognized as movements within the total psyche, each with its own necessity. This I believe, is the true purpose of consciousness. Not to dominate the unconscious, but to enter into dialogue with it, not to erase instinct, but to ennoble it, not to escape darkness, but to illuminate it. We are both the dreamer and the dream, the question and the answer, the seeker and the sought. And when we begin to live from this awareness, something extraordinary happens. Peace no longer depends on circumstances. The outer world may still bring storms, but the inner center remains still. You begin to move through life like a vessel of quiet knowing. You act not from compulsion, but from alignment. You create not to prove, but to express. That, my friends, is what it means to be truly alive. We come now to one of the most painful realizations on the path toward wholeness. No one is coming to save us. Humanity has always sought saviors, prophets, leaders, lovers, ideologies, anything that might relieve us of the burden of our own transformation. But the path of individuation cannot be walked by proxy. It is solitary, and it demands the courage to become one's own authority. This realization feels cruel at first, because the child in us still longs for protection. It yearns for the parent, the teacher, the divine figure who will tell us what to do, who will bless our choices and remove our suffering. But the self, that mysterious inner center which orchestrates our growth, insists on our maturity. It withdraws the illusion of rescue, precisely so that we might discover the latent power within us. We mistake this withdrawal for abandonment. We say, life has turned against me, God is silent. But it is not silence, it is initiation. The silence is the sound of the self stepping back, saying, now you must walk. It is the same silence a parent offers when a child learns to stand. The fall, the pain, the trembling are all necessary. Without them, no strength can be born. To take responsibility for one's life is not a moral demand. It is an act of liberation. Responsibility, in its truest sense, means responsibility, the capacity to respond consciously to what arises. As long as we remain trapped in blame, resentment, or dependence, we cannot hear the voice of the self. The psyche speaks only to those who are willing to listen without excuses. And yet, modern man has perfected the art of avoidance. He distracts himself with endless entertainment, intellectual debate, and busyness. He calls this living, but it is merely a sophisticated escape from being. Our entire culture is built upon this avoidance. It tells us that fulfillment lies outside, in success, in wealth, in relationships, in recognition. But each of these promises is temporary, and the more we chase them, the more enslaved we become. The truth is simpler and infinitely more demanding. The meaning you seek cannot be given to you. It must be created from within. No therapist, no religion, no system can give it ready-made, others can guide, but the actual work, the confrontation with your own fear, your own lies, your own unlived potential that belongs only to you, this is the turning point where the soul separates from the collective hypnosis of dependency. It is also the point where loneliness intensifies, because when you no longer define yourself through others, the world seems to recede. The familiar comforts vanish. You feel stripped of identity, of belonging. Many retreat at this stage, returning to the old persona just to feel safe again. But those who endure discover something astonishing. Solitude is not emptiness. It is communion with one's own depths. To stand alone is to stand in truth. It is to allow every external illusion to fall away until only the essential remains. And the essential is always the same. Consciousness itself, awareness without ornament, naked and luminous. In that stillness, we realize that the self was never distant. It was simply waiting for us to stop fleeing. The individuated person becomes, in a sense, their own parent. They carry within themselves both the authority and the tenderness. Once sought outside, they no longer beg for validation, they grant it. They no longer plead for forgiveness, they extend it inward. This inner integration marks the birth of true maturity, but maturity, in the Jungian sense, is not the end of suffering. It is the transformation of suffering into meaning. Pain does not disappear, it becomes intelligible. Each hardship reveals itself as part of a larger design. Each loss as a necessary purification. The soul, freed from victimhood, begins to see patterns where the ego once saw punishment. From this vantage point, life ceases to be a series of accidents. Every encounter, every disappointment, every period of darkness becomes a thread in the great tapestry of individuation. Even betrayal, that most painful of human experiences, serves to expose what within us still seeks external approval. When we no longer project our unlived power onto others, betrayal loses its sting. The other is no longer a thief of our worth, but a mirror revealing our misplaced dependence. This is why I often said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Fate is merely the unconscious, unrecognized. Once it is recognized, it transforms into destiny. And destiny is nothing other than the conscious participation in the unfolding of the self when we assume responsibility for our own inner world. The outer world responds differently. We cease to attract situations that mirror our ignorance and begin to meet those that mirror our growth. This is not metaphysical magic. It is psychological law. The outer environment corresponds to the state of the inner kingdom. A fragmented psyche produces a chaotic life. An integrated psyche radiates coherence. And coherence attracts order, but to maintain such coherence, one must live truthfully, ruthlessly, truthfully. The smallest act of self-betrayal reopens the old wound. To say yes when one means no, to conform when one's conscience rebels, to hide the truth for comfort, these are not minor errors. They are psychic poisons. Each compromise distances us from the self, and the psyche responds with unease, fatigue, or confusion. Integrity, then, is not a moral virtue. It is hygiene for the soul. It preserves the bridge between conscious and unconscious. And that bridge is fragile, easily corroded by dishonesty, fear, or conformity. The moment we betray ourselves, the dialogue between ego and self becomes distorted, and we lose our inner compass. That is when anxiety returns, not as an enemy, but as a signal that we have strayed from alignment. To live responsibly means to live in alignment with inner truth, even when it costs us comfort, approval, or belonging. It means daring to disappoint others rather than betraying the soul. It means walking away from the familiar cave of dependency, knowing that the light you seek will not be found on any map. At first, this path feels like exile. The world does not easily understand those who follow an inner voice, but the farther one walks, the more one discovers companions, not externally, but archetypally: the wise old man, the loving mother, the courageous warrior, the playful child, all arise from within as living presences. They are the eternal patterns of the collective unconscious, now active in our psyche. They guide, comfort, and instruct us as we cross the wilderness of transformation. Eventually, this inner companionship dissolves even the need for external recognition. You begin to see every human being as part of the same vast psyche, each one playing their role in the drama of awakening. The person who wounds you is not merely an enemy. They are an archetype testing your boundaries. The person who inspires you is not merely a mentor. They are an image of your own potential. This recognition changes everything. Life ceases to be adversarial and becomes alchemical. At this stage, we begin to understand that every experience, joy, pain, love, loss, is an operation of the same divine experiment. The evolution of consciousness, the universe itself, is engaged in the process of becoming aware through us. Every act of awareness expands the cosmos a little further. That is why self-knowledge is sacred. To know oneself is to participate in the knowing of God, and yet the process never ends. Individuation is not a destination. It is a rhythm, a breathing. The ego expands. The unconscious reveals more. The old structures dissolve. New ones emerge. Each time we think we have arrived, the self unveils deeper. The mystery cannot be possessed, only lived. The challenge, then, is not to achieve perfection, but to remain faithful to the dialogue, to listen each day to the voice within, to interpret the dreams, to honor the symbols, to stay awake in the midst of noise. For the unconscious is not an abstract idea. It is a living partner in our existence. When we cooperate with it, life becomes creative. When we resist it, life becomes mechanical. If we truly understood this, we would no longer envy others nor seek power over them. We would realize that each soul has its own appointed path, its own tempo of awakening. Comparison would appear absurd. The flower does not envy the tree, the river does not compete with the sea. Each fulfills its nature, and in doing so, serves the whole. This is the vision that arises when the ego surrenders its tyranny. We cease trying to control life and begin to collaborate with it. We stop asking, why is this happening to me? And begin asking, what is this asking of me? And in that single shift, suffering transforms into dialogue, and destiny begins to unfold when the veil of illusion finally falls, when we stop expecting salvation from without and turn inward. We enter the most profound of all transformations. We no longer seek to escape suffering. We begin to understand it. Suffering, seen through the eyes of consciousness, becomes a teacher. It shows us where we are clinging, where we are false, where we have not yet learned to love. There is a certain humility that comes with awakening. The man who has truly descended into his depths no longer believes in grandiosity. He does not imagine himself superior to the unawakened. He sees rather that all of humanity is caught in the same struggle, the tension between the mask and the soul, between the fear of death and the longing for eternity. Compassion is born from this recognition. To have suffered consciously is to understand the secret pain of others. When we awaken, we cease to divide the world into the enlightened and the ignorant. We begin to perceive that the same light hides behind every form of darkness. Even those who resist truth, who project their shadow onto others, who live in denial, they too are expressions of the same divine process. The self is at work in all, even in distortion. Nothing in the psyche is wasted. Even chaos has its role in the great economy of transformation. This understanding frees us from judgment. The ego judges because it fears. The self observes because it knows. When you see from the self, you no longer need to condemn. You simply recognize. You understand that each soul is on its path, and that interference before readiness is violence. Love, at this level, becomes spacious. It waits, it allows, it trusts the timing of the soul. In such consciousness, the opposites, good and evil, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, begin to reconcile. The war within ceases because one has realized that both poles serve the same totality. The devil, as I once wrote, is the shadow of God. To integrate that truth is not to justify evil, but to transcend moral dualism and see the unity that underlies the conflict. The alchemists called this reconciliation conjunctio oppositorum, the sacred marriage of opposites. Within that union, the heart becomes whole. Wholeness does not mean flawlessness. It means the ability to contain everything, the anger and the forgiveness, the desire and the restraint, the despair and the hope. To be whole is to stand at the center of the storm and know that the storm too is yourself. From that center, life ceases to be a battle and becomes a dance. But this dance is not passive. Wholeness does not mean resignation. It means conscious participation in the rhythm of existence. One becomes, as it were, a co-creator with life itself. Decisions no longer arise from fear or conformity, but from intuition, the silent knowing that emanates from the self. You may still stumble, still doubt, still feel human weakness, but even your weakness becomes meaningful. There is no longer any waste, because everything belongs, and in that belonging, freedom arises, not the freedom of doing whatever one pleases, but the deeper freedom of being what one truly is. The chains that fall away are invisible. The need to impress, the hunger for control, the addiction to certainty. We discover that life was never meant to be mastered, only lived. To live is to participate in mystery. To control is to resist it. From that state of participation, joy returns, not as euphoria, but as quiet radiance. It is not the joy of achievement, but of alignment. One feels in harmony with the world, even when the world is turbulent. One senses an invisible current carrying all things toward greater awareness. And this current, once feared as chaos, is now recognized as grace. At this point in the journey, death itself changes, meaning what we once feared as annihilation reveals itself as continuation, the return of consciousness to the greater whole from which it came. The ego resists death because it confuses identity with eternity. But when we have tasted the reality of the self, we know that what we are cannot truly die. The forms change, the essence remains. To accept mortality is to participate in immortality consciously. This is why the individuation process is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. It brings man to the threshold where psychology becomes mysticism, where the study of the soul becomes communion with the divine. The modern world has separated these realms, but they were never truly apart. The unconscious is not a dark cellar beneath reason. It is the temple of the divine within us. To descend into it is not regression, it is pilgrimage. And what of fear? Fear that ancient guardian does not disappear, but it loses its tyranny. We begin to see it as part of life's texture, a signal, not an enemy. Whenever fear arises, we know that something sacred stands nearby. We learn to approach it, not with violence, but with curiosity. What are you trying to show me? We ask. And the answer always deepens us. When we live in this way, the world itself begins to mirror our transformation. Synchronicities multiply, not as proofs of power, but as confirmations of connection. The universe becomes intimate, personal, alive. Every encounter feels significant because it is the boundary between inner and outer dissolves, and one realizes that the world is psyche, just as psyche is world. At that moment, the separation between self and God evaporates. What we once worshipped as external divinity now burns quietly within us. The sacred was never somewhere else, It was hidden beneath the rubble of our illusions. When we finally uncover it, we do not become gods, we become whole humans, which is far rarer. This is what it means to be reborn, not to escape the world, but to inhabit it fully, not to transcend humanity, but to sanctify it. Each breath, each act becomes prayer, work becomes service, relationship becomes mirror, solitude becomes temple. Nothing is wasted, everything is woven into meaning. And so, after the long descent and the painful disillusionment, we emerge not as saints, but as real beings, aware, grounded, compassionate, and alive. We no longer need to pretend. We no longer need to explain ourselves. We walk with quiet strength because we know that life itself walks within us. To those who are still in the darkness, still trapped in the collapse of their former world, I say this: do not despair. The darkness you feel is not the absence of light, it is a preparation of sight. The eyes must first adjust before they can see the stars. Trust the process that is unfolding within you. It is ancient, intelligent, and purposeful. The self will not abandon you, though it may lead you through solitude, through fear, through the dismantling of everything you once held dear. Its goal is not your comfort, but your wholeness. And wholeness is worth every loss when you can finally say, without resistance, I am what I am, no more, no less. You will know peace. You will understand that to be human is already divine, that to live consciously is the ultimate form of worship. So let us stop fleeing from ourselves. Let us cease pretending that normality is sanity. Let us dare to listen to the whisper of the soul beneath the noise of the world. For if we do, we will discover that salvation was never outside. It was the awakening of what has always been within. And when that awakening comes, life no longer needs to be perfect. It only needs to be real. Then we shall live not as fragments, but as wholeness itself.